Welcome to Intersections, where faith, ideas, and life meet. Today our topic is film. The title is Reel to Reel, Faith in Film. Is film good? Are there challenges to film? Are there films we simply must view? Or are there films that we should never observe? Those are the questions that we'll be dealing with today. I remember once, several years ago, where I was watching the movie Ben-Hur in my living room. The movie had just ended, and all of a sudden I felt a trembling in the house. And normally when I feel that trembling, living in California, I become very frightened, and my heart starts beating more quickly, and I become very afraid as I run to the door jamb and get underneath it. But this night was very different. The movie had just ended. I felt the shaking in the house, and as I walked to the door jamb, I remember distinctly feeling how odd it was that I felt so at peace, because I had just watched the movie Ben-Hur, and I was so overwhelmed by God's love and care for us, and even guidance in our lives, that I felt that no matter what happened in the earthquake, that the outcome was already cared for by God, and that I was in His hands. So the topic again today is film, reel to reel, faith in film.
Carla, I think your experience is one that isn't not abnormal. That's for sure. Even though film as a media has only been around for a short period of time, it seems like everywhere people watch films, whether it's for entertainment purposes or, in this case, it seems like the film made a really powerful impact on your life. What are some of our favorite films? I'm just curious.
Well, for me, the most favorite film is one that probably very few people have seen, unfortunately. It's called He Who Must Die. It's the story of a Greek Orthodox church community on the island of Crete, and there is an Ottoman-appointed governor who ends up playing the role of Pilate, in effect. And every year, the Greek Orthodox Church puts on the Passion Play. And a year before that's performed, people are assigned roles, and the film shows how everybody grows into their role, Doubting Thomas, and so on. And the shepherd in that island of Crete, is assigned to the role of Jesus, and he tries to reconcile two competing groups and is killed in the process. He's who must die, and of course it's Christ.
Oh, it's the shepherd that must die.
Right.
Yeah.
Because so it's a very powerful film, I thought.
And just so the viewers will understand, it's hard to find.
It is hard to find.
Because I know I looked for it and couldn't find it. So.
Right. Well, that's my favorite. What about you folks?
You know, I go back to when I was a kid. That's a little while ago. But growing up in Australia, movie-going was not something that a lot of Christians believed in. And so movies would be rented out by the local college. You know, we'd have a Saturday night movie. The atmosphere in the movie theatres was something that was frowned on. Well, the film that was shown was either Old Yeller or My Dog Buddy.
Pretty venturesome.
I'm not sure which one it was, but I was about 9 at the time. And the poignancy of the dog saving somebody's life, I just remember being really moved. And I'm walking home and I'm getting teased by an older guy with us. And I was so emotional, and I'm trying to think as a 9-year-old, why am I so emotional? And I think films can bring out incredibly powerful emotions. Why does that happen?
Well, I'm just thinking about your question about why does that happen is what makes it impossible for me to choose my favorite film.
So
I'd have to narrow
back to Ben-Hur when you felt a lot of comfort.
Right. And at that point, Ben-Hur was my favorite film because that brought that kind of comfort. And then I remember a time when To Kill a Mockingbird was my favorite film. And then I have a favorite Japanese film and a favorite, you know, so it all depends on what I'm trying to understand. But I think To Kill a Mockingbird was my favorite for a while because it helped me look at family values, and it also helped me at least begin to understand race relations, having grown up in the South. I'm not saying that everything depicted in that film is correct, but it helped me as I watched a man who believed in inequality for all people, and how it was a film of honor, a man that would dedicate his time and energy and money and career to defending those who weren't used to being defended. You're about to say something. You're about to crash my whole argument. What is it? What is it?
Before the program is over, I just hope you tell us what your favorite is right now, because we want an insight into what you're like right now.
Oh, I see. All right. Well, I'll think about that one.
Films do, right?
And I think in that way, film is very emotive, you know, of the human experience. Whether it's something that you said you could relate to, or something that I feel like I could never relate to. One of my favorite films is Life is Beautiful, foreign film, Italian, written, directed by Roberto Benigni,
Yes.
who won, actually won an Oscar for his role as an Italian Jewish father whose family ended up in a concentration camp. You know, and that's something that I
He
could.
took his kid with him, didn't
Yeah.
he? Somehow.
Well, you know, now, Jeremy, we're honest on this. That I didn't like that film.
Really?
Because I know. No, I did not. Because life is beautiful. I just thought that the irony was too much. I just wanted to say, look, this is not a good situation. It is not a beautiful situation. Get real here. That was the effect on me.
Well, see, and for me, I think that a lot of times, some of the images that we see in film, especially in popular films today, become harangued because of the negative images that are brought out. And when a father dies and a family is torn apart and that kind of thing, it's difficult. How is there any beauty in that? For me, I think it's the beauty in the dissonance. That's what's really drawn out
Well,
of it.
also the relationship of the father to the son is beautiful in the midst of horror.
But he lies to him, Roy.
But he shelters
Because-
him. He protects him.
But is that the way you protect your children, by lying to them?
There's a
and
time to
explaining
protect kids. Maybe we don't protect kids enough.
Well, I'm going to talk about another World War II movie. And
Exposed to all sorts of stuff. Go ahead.
this doesn't go back to my childhood. It goes earlier than that. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator,
Oh, yeah.
which is humorous, but it was biting satire about Hitler. And he really took his own little character, of, his own famous character, and made it into Hitler. And it made fun of him from beginning to end. And I thought it was a very powerful thing to do early in the war.
Why? What effect do you
Because
think
it
that
cut
Cut to the chase?
Hitler down
Yes.
to size. He said, "Don't be so frightened of this man. I know he's conquered most of Europe, but he's a tiny little guy."
Tiny little guy, yeah. But he wasn't. So do you think, I mean, Hitler wasn't a tiny little guy. So do you think it had a...
That's why comics have the audacity of hope. They see something beyond the immediate, and if it's a horror, they're going to cut it down to size so that people can attack those folks as just ordinary people.
So you don't think it
Trivialized.
trivialized the danger?
I think it trivialized it in a way that was great.
People could laugh. We need to laugh at times.
They were scared to death of Hitler, and he was saying, the dictator has no clothes. Let me show you.
But in some ways, though, that kind of a portrayal of, let's say, for example, a historical character, at that time, it was more of a contemporary scene. But what about how films affect our perception of reality?
And this is where
especially in the
it can be
historicals.
very dangerous with some of the films. For instance, I'm thinking of some of the current ones where somebody takes a theme, goes overboard with it, and it's seen in different parts of the world where people do not have education.
Well, let's pick a specific. You said current. I'm thinking of an early one, a silent film actually, The Birth of a Nation, where you're talking about, Jeremy, films that set perceptions. I mean, that film really affected perceptions of, well,
Black people in the South.
the whole black experience in relation to specifically white women, that they were a danger to white women. And that, I think, wouldn't you say, even though that was a silent film, it took years to counter those images?
Sure, and I think Gone with the Wind, which was a talk film,
Yeah.
it was Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh, it carried on those stereotypes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Both of the whites and the blacks in the South, I think.
Yeah. And women.
Right.
Yeah. So film can be dangerous, I guess we would
Sure.
agree.
Yeah, it can be.
So what is a challenging aspect of film viewing if film can be dangerous? I mean, what is the point of films? I know most people, you just look at a little kid watching a film, they've got their mouth open, their eyes glued to the screen. I mean, what is the, the challenging aspect?
Don't you think that films are like any writing, any kind of art, which tries to reproduce the reality of the human experience and the natural experience, but also portrays what can happen when that life is at its greatest? In other words, it shows you the awful things about the world, but it also often portrays people who somehow overcome it. Very few films, that's a big sweeping statement, very few films leave you with complete depression. There's no hope. Now, I know there's lots of them that leave you there, but I think a lot of films try to portray difficulties, but somehow people begin to overcome them. No?
No, I agree. I just think that film very often, done poorly, limits the imagination. I mean, like, I was trying to think, have I ever both read a book and watched a film of the same subject, and have I ever thought the film was better?
I have one.
You do?
Well, it's as good, I thought.
Okay.
The Kite Runner.
The film was as good as the book.
I thought so.
Do you think that's typical?
No.
And why?
But you made a broad statement, so I immediately thought of an objection. Why? Because I think you like your own imagination better than the director's imagination. And I think that, writing allows you to go anywhere your imagination takes you.
Right.
But for some people, for myself, for example, film is, it captures me in a way that writing or art or anything like that could never do. For that brief period of time, an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it is, I'm just completely almost in another world in a way, which, I mean, I guess could be a good thing or a bad thing.
Is that escapism, though? See, sometimes those of us who live very busy lives, it's time to put your feet up and let the rest of your body catch up with your mind. So maybe watching films is a time to do that? Can you get mileage out of that comment? I mean,
well, but there's different levels of film, aren't there? There's film that help you escape, but then there's some film that doesn't allow you to escape anything. It actually pulls you into having to think about things like Judgment at Nuremberg. You're not escaping anything.
So you wouldn't watch one of those films if you wanted to escape?
Exactly.
Okay,
it's
so
like,
there's certain films. So what kind of film would you watch for escaping?
I don't, personally, I don't watch much film to escape. Like for TV, I'm not a TV watcher. So do you watch film to escape?
I was trying to think of, I think one that people may have seen that I think is a little bit escapist is The Black Stallion, which is just beautiful photography, really. It's got some story to it, but it's not something that confronts me with some major social issue and tragedy. And I felt good coming out of it, sure.
Come up for air so you can take on life again.
But you're not serious about film, then. You're serious about life, but not necessarily about film.
You mean if film is
If all
only
of it is
escapism?
escapism.
I liked your quote about how when you read a book, you can use your imagination. When you watch a film, your imagination is limited by the director. And so that brings a big challenge. Now, does that bring a challenge when we watch religious films, inspirational films? When you read the Bible, you can use your imagination. When it's put in film, is your imagination curtailed?
Well, that's why I liked He Who Must Die, because it was telling the story of the passion of Jesus. But it wasn't looking at it straight on. It was filtering it through a human experience. And I somehow found that much more authentic and real, and I could identify with it better. Once it says Jesus, then all kinds of things come into play, like I can't really look at it as like any other film and so on.
Now we're right on the verge of talking about the Passion. Is that the name? The Passion?
The Passion of the Christ.
The Passion of the Christ. Anybody want to?
You had something
That's
to say,
it? You're going to go just to the verge? And that's it?
title of the story. Right.
We're right on the verge. Anybody want to go over?
Well, I think it brings up a good point in terms of how biblical principles or our own religious sort of moral codes guide us in our film watching. Because I know, you brought up the Passion of the Christ. Now, there's many people who would argue, wow, you know, it's a religious film. It's obviously showing the story of Jesus beginning at Peter's betrayal and then continuing on through his crucifixion. You know, and by all normal accounts, it's a biblical portrayal via film. And yet, for myself personally, the film is just very difficult to watch.
Because,
you know, because it's so violent,
yeah.
and because it's just so. You don't leave with a warm, fuzzy feeling after watching The Passion.
Are you supposed to leave with a warm, fuzzy feeling?
What you said drew you to going to films,
Is
to
escape-
relax.
is-
That's exactly what you were going for, a warm, fuzzy feeling.
Well,
But-
yeah.
Well, you were talking before, Jeremy, about somebody making a comment. I think it's in the Bible, but I'm not quite sure what the story is. And say a little bit about that. That, you know, different type of people that get drawn to films.
Well, I think that you know, film can appeal to people across different cultural boundaries, intellectual boundaries, and that sort of thing. You know, I know for myself personally, like you brought up the example of reading the story in the Bible versus actually seeing it portrayed via film. I have a very difficult time with that imagination factor personally. And I don't know how many people out there have this same dilemma. When I read something, for example, I'm reading words on a page. I'm reading the story of Jesus' crucifixion. I see words. In my mind, I see words. Just like you would see words written on a typed page or on a computer screen or anything, I see words. I don't see pictures. I don't see images. And so for me, film brings those things to life. That, you know, and so it's kind of a daunting task, I would say, of the director, who is sort of, in a sense, left in charge of my mental impression, you know, of whatever thing it is that I'm seeing.
I just want to say one word about The Passion. I thought it was a terrible movie, a film. And
Don't hold back, Roy. Just
first of all, there was the depiction of violence, but what was truly objectionable was that violence seemed to be salvific.
salvific. Yeah, I knew.
And that is absolutely horrendous to say.
And I agree with you, Roy. That disturbed me too about the film, but I will say that there was a redemptive moment for me in the film, and that is where the tear came down and shattered over the world. I was overwhelmed by God's love right there. But would I watch the film over to view that? No. Which brings another question, is should we be watching films through which we get some small redemptive nugget if the majority of the film is...
Not if the film is The Passion of Christ.
You really didn't like that film, did you?
Well, I mean, I think that does bring up a good point because, you know, there are a lot of churches and Bible study groups, etc., who use film to draw biblical correlations out of, you know, or moral kind of, you know, the moral of the story is, because so many people watch film nowadays, you know, that it's easy to look and to say, well, what kind of good moral nugget can I glean out of this? We host a film series on campus, and recently we hosted a very popular grossing film, Batman: The Dark Knight. And we received some very negative criticism for drawing any kind of a, you know, biblical Christolic symbolism out of that story. For me personally, the film was touching in that way. Roy, you mentioned earlier how, you know, in some ways, when it's overtly religious, or if it, you know, if you see Jesus on the screen, then it kind of, in a way, takes away from that. And for me, I feel the same way.
How could Batman have those themes in it that you mentioned?
Well, I guess for those who have seen the film, you know, Batman is cast as the Dark Knight.
Instead of a white knight.
Yes, in a way, sort of taking on the sins of the world and being downcast by society because he was the only one capable of doing it, kind of thing.
But wouldn't you admit, though, Jeremy, there's a lot of violence in that film.
Certainly, yeah, there
and the
is.
question was, should you put yourself through watching a lot of violence in order to see something that you could get by reading Scripture?
Certainly.
I mean, wasn't that part of the question?
I think that is the question.
Which takes us in some ways to, what is our guide? What is your personal guide for watching film?
Well, I think that people ought to find critics whom they come to admire, and then read what they say about a film, because they're there, they're a front line for proclaiming whether this is worth spending your time on. You may not agree with the critic in the end, but I think that that's one point. There's another thing, and that is films now are not dominated by stars. They don't determine what's in the film. It's the writers and the directors, and sometimes the director is the writer. And I think if you start seeing a director who's pretty consistent, and he is terrific, then you'd look at the director and see what that person is going to be coming out with. For example, David Lean did Bridge on the River Kwai, which I thought was fantastic, portraying a moral dilemma, nobility in the midst of the Second World War in Asia. Well, then, when other of his films came out, I at least gave them, I presumed they were pretty good. And by George, Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. So I would say directors and critics, watch them.
Well, and I would agree. I just want to talk for a second about directors. I mean, critics. I would say almost never watch a film, old film included, that I don't read what the critics have said.
But how many people do that?
Well, maybe I would hope that we can encourage more people to do
think
that.
that's important.
Let's talk just for a minute about how to do that. Because if you are looking at a film, say it's an old 1950s film, how do you find out what the critics say about it?
Go ahead. You've done it. So.
Well, what I do is I Google the film, and I Google the film and the word reviews and critics. And I get some of I read many reviews on it. And then, of course, the New Yorker, past New Yorkers, and in the copies of the New Yorker reviews movies. But
Right. I think Googling is surely the best, the most effective way. There are certain journals that I tend to respect their critics, the New York Times and the New Yorker. When I lived in Washington, the Washington Post. I think the LA Times critic is a little too easy to be pleased by what comes out of Hollywood.
yes. Well, and I would say the New Yorker doesn't always consider moral worth.
Right.
You know,
So-
I like it that you're giving some tools. So Google before, because how many people go to a movie theater complex and there's 5 movies showing, they're 10 minutes late for the one they want to see, so what else is on, they jump in.
And particularly they follow the stars, which is just ludicrous.
Well, and not just a movie complex, but just watching a film in your own home. And this is why I hate TV, is because you can't make decisions ahead of watching it.
Yeah.
So
you
with
can
film,
with TiVo.
but where do you go to read the critics?
Yeah, true.
You know, you might be able to record it ahead, but you don't. Where do you go to find out what the critics have said? And that's where I think film was.
I think that's particularly apropos when you're making decisions on behalf of others as well.
Yeah.
You know, I've found myself on more than one occasion caught between a rock and a hard place when I've selected a film, you know, on behalf of my friends or family or whoever I'm going to see the film with, and afterwards or midway through the film, I'll be thinking, man, I really wish I had done some more research on this, because maybe it's morally reprehensible, or it's just not a very good film, or whatever the case may be. Especially when you're considering, you know, children and their film viewing experience.
Have you ever had the experience where the good thing in that film has left such a deep impression on you that you want other people to see it, and you've forgotten those objectionable parts?
Oh,
But then you show it and you said, how did I forget that
Certainly.
Or
part?
how did I miss that?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
the games that your mind plays with you sometimes when you're looking for inspiration and you tune the other stuff out.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk for a minute about what film, a couple of things, biblical guidelines for film viewing, other than whatsoever thing is pure, honest. What guidelines biblically are there for film? And then the second question is, do we have films that we'd say, this is a film that most anyone ought to see?
Ought to see.
Ought to see, that you think they ought to see.
Well, as far as the biblical principles, I think maybe it's not principles
Okay.
so much, because that would make it easy, you know. But I would think a biblical perspective. For example, the great controversy between good and evil. If there's a film that really portrays the conflict between good and evil and follows the Bible and saying, here's some hope, that might be a guideline for
So
people.
if there's no hope, in the movie.
And it's talking about the conflict between good and evil, then I might have some problems. I think also if there's a film that is a prophetic film, that is to say it is protesting a certain evil, that is a biblical perspective, you know? And so there are lots of films that portray people who stood up, you know, when there was oppression in the mines of West Virginia, and they organized the workers. Or there's a problem of the environment, and somebody stood up and did something.
Yes,
To
heroic,
me, that's
yeah.
biblical in a broad sense of a prophetic voice against evil.
And the same can be true in the context of films characterizing different historical events, or you know, wars, or that kind of thing. The things that we can learn, basically, you know, history not repeating itself and that kind of thing. I mean, I think that's very biblical.
Yeah, and I would add to, I mean, it's very similar to Roy, what you're saying, Roy, is figures who worked on the behalf of the oppressed. Like I'm thinking specifically Scarlet and the Black, a priest that very conscientiously worked on the behalf of the Jews who were being killed, is a biblical principle. Yeah.
There's a film that I would recommend.
Okay.
You wanted that as a part of the ending. A Man for All Seasons.
Oh.
And it's not so much, frankly, the film. It's the play that was written by Robert Bolt that was filmed. It is a fantastic study of a very sophisticated, very civilized man, a friend of Erasmus, who was witty and liked power, but he had a line and he wouldn't go past it. A Man for All Seasons.
So that's a great note to end on in terms of film watching. I think what I'm taking from here is research before you watch a film. Spend time ahead looking at what is it I'm going to get out of this film. Read what the critics say. And then look for themes before you even go into it. And we're about out of time. Thank you for joining us on Intersections, where faith, life, and ideas meet.